Greetings, friends. I'm doing another video on the Thymos series, and this is relating to an ebook I released, which is Studies in Thymos, and it's just 7 or 8, maybe 8 essays, which I've kind of investigated different thinkers and their relationship to Thymos. Thymos, of course, for you who don't know, is the spirited side of the Platonic triad of the soul. You got reason, spirit, and desire. So spirit is Thymos is another word for spirit. So um we're just gonna look. This section is on, and I'll leave a link to the ebook in the description if you want to get it. This section is on, there's two sections on Plato, and this is the first section on Plato. And we look at one of Plato's lesser known dialogue. This is a very short dialogue. It's called Laches. And Laches is the name of a military general who Socrates has a conversation with. There's more people than just Laches in his dialogue. There's a few different people, but we'll go over this. So I'm just going to basically read out the section. It's about 4 or 5 pages. The general background to this is, well, we're going to actually, I think I probably described this in the introduction, so I'll just start reading through it. So it's cultivation, courage, and epistemology. We're going to be looking basically at kind of how knowledge affects the cultivation of virtue. Not just the cultivation of virtue, but specifically courage, and how this cultivation of virtue ends up in sort of intergenerational contentions. And there's basically a strong theme of the last man here in this dialogue, which is interesting because we kind of think of the last man as a specifically modern problem, and I suppose it's more of a modern problem, but it's also something which is quite, there's a clear awareness of in this dialogue. So I'll just start reading through it. Laches is a little known Platonic dialogue commonly referred to as a dialogue which deals with the question of what is courage. For this reason, it has obvious connections to our investigations into Thymos. The dialogue sees two wealthy Greek men, I'm going to pronounce these wrong, Lysimachus and Melasias, and also military generals Laches and Nicias, and they are in a conversation with Socrates in this dialogue, obviously. They are concerned for the education of their sons, as this is Lysimachus and Melasias. They are concerned for the education of their sons and ask Socrates for help. Ask Socrates to help them decipher the best method of teaching virtue. The dialogue is centered around the value of teaching young men to fight in heavy armor. Armor, of course, has a connection to courage in the sense that it makes one feel more courageous in battle through feeling more secure. The nature of courage, virtue, and how one acquires it then becomes the theme of discussion. Lysimachus opens up the dialogue by expressing a sort of shame which stemmed from himself and Melasias' comfortable and luxurious lives. They are wealthy Greek men as well, just to let you know. They are intent on teaching their sons, and we assume their grandsons, things which could make them better men, more courageous, disciplined, and virtuous. The topic begins by asking the question of whether heavy armor should be worn in battle. The particular topic, however, will simply expand into the larger conversation of what is courage, what is virtue, and this will implicitly ask, can and how and should it be taught? Lysimachus and Melasias converse with Nicias and Laches, and of course Socrates announces the motivation of such an occasion and the justification for even wondering about the value of fighting in heavy armor. He states, both of us often talk to the lads about the many noble deeds which our fathers did in war and peace and in the management of the allies and in the administration of the city, but neither of us has any deeds of his own which he can show. The truth is that we are ashamed of this contrast being seen by them, and we blame our fathers for letting us be spoiled in the days of our youth while they were occupied with the concerns of others. And we urge all this upon the lads, pointing out to them that they will not grow up with honor if they are rebellious and take no pains about themselves. But if they take pains, they may perhaps become worthy of the names which they bear. What we see here is more than simply an abstract questioning of what it means to be better or equal to the last generation and under what standards. Rather, Lysimachus expresses an honesty concerning his shame for not having the opportunity to prove himself worthy of his status and name. His father never took the time to challenge him in a way which could create this sense of worthiness, and so he feels he is only respected because of the deeds of others and not, and due to factors which are totally contingent, like his birth. There's also just a side note. There's also, I think, the fact that the Republic is, this is obviously not the Republic, but this is Plato, so it's relatable. Is not a simple birthright authority. You're not simply passing on authority by birthright. There's a kind of there's a discussion over justified leadership and where that should come from and so on and so forth. And this goes into more detail in the Republic. So you can see this is relatable to the Republic in a sense that as soon as you start to think about justifiable leaderships beyond merely birthright, these questions automatically start to come up. He happens to be born into a powerful family. This is one of the wealthy Greek men, Lysimachus Melasius. He happens to be born into a wealthy, into a powerful family, rather than necessarily being valuable himself. This building awareness concerning the justification of our place in society is what leads us to demand the introduction of Socratic examination. It is also intrinsically an inevitable conflict of Plato's more meritocratic view of hierarchy as opposed to a simple monarchical or aristocratic lineage. This initial need for Socratic inquiry is opened up by a feeling of shame, shame being one of the thymonic emotions, which opens up the conversation not just of what is courage, but as a sort of awareness of the emotion which signifies an insecurity or lack surrounding it, and what can be done about it. In modern times, the awareness of how our social and economic conditions affect us, determine what we are, is what Marxists began calling overcoming our conditions. It is noteworthy to see this awareness in the historical context of ancient Greece, where one might assume simply being born under the illusion of birthright was sufficient to feel worthy. In fact, this insecurity and even shame concerning how one can prove oneself to actually be worthy of their name is the initial grounding for the Socratic inquiry in this dialogue. It should also be noted that a certain awareness of civilizational decadence is implicit here also. Cycles of powerful families whom are created through great struggles and recognizably great deeds begin to fade out after a few generations, and should the inheritors of such a world feel confident in their stance within it, they may be accompanied with such an insecurity and shame which births the inquiry into what is virtue and what is courage, or am I a worthy citizen, son, leader, and so on. In modern times, this theme was addressed by Nietzsche, although entirely unrelated to this dialogue, coined the last man, as compared to the modern last man who just assumes his role, often with melancholy and anxiety. These Platonic characters are not afraid to introduce Socratic questioning to address their concerns. Socrates is far less powerful and wealthy than all other men involved in this dialogue, and so we could see their honest questioning of their own social place with the tolerance of Socrates into the conversation. There's a kind of willingness to be criticized here, willingness to be a little bit more, I don't mean vulnerable in a kind of like emotional sense, I just mean like vulnerable in the sense of like letting someone who is beneath you in social rank, especially for an old, kind of society, which ancient Greece was, where there was obviously a very much a respect for hierarchy and so on, to let someone who's kind of, you're not really sure what they're going to say and they're beneath you in status and so on, to let them um, to let them, what's the word, inquire into this lack of worthiness that these men feel and so on. There's a sort of strength expressed through that, right? To let one criticize you kind of expresses, I suppose, a confidence and so on. So now getting into the contents of the actual dialogue and not simply the motivation for it, we can see the Lashes and Nicias generally take opposing sides on the issues brought up. Nicias and Lashes take over early in the dialogue from Melesias and Lysimachus. Nicias and Lashes are interested in war tactics. Nicias plays a role of a rational tactician. He can see the benefits of learning to fight in heavy armor, the confidence it could give to soldiers, and the intimidation it may invoke towards enemies. We should learn this skill, he asserts. Laches generally plays the role of the experienced soldier. He actually fought in the Battle of Delium with Socrates and so vouches for him at the beginning of the conversation. On the very outset, Laches becomes skeptical of the use of heavy armor in combat. He's also skeptical of seeing it simply as a skill which can be universally useful. Lashes is very not. He's very much not a kind of utilitarian thinker. We're gonna see this in a minute. He takes account of both the character of the user and the effect it may have on other soldiers. Quote from Lashes: "If the possessor of this art be a coward, he will simply be. He will be likely to become rash, and his character will only become more notorious. Or if he is brave and he fails ever so little, other men will be on watch and will be greatly traduced." End quote. Latches sees this as more than just the rational deployment of a skill, but as something of which we must take into account the character of the user and the appearance of the manner it is used. If a coward has too much armor, he will become sort of maniacal with power and self-confidence. If a brave man uses it and gets injured, his reputation as brave will be destroyed. I believe that the manner in which Socrates is initiated into dialogue is significant. Laches assures Socrates that seeing his participation in the Battle of Delium, he has thoroughly convinced him that a cross-examination from Socrates will be worthwhile. This initiation is significant because it sees a crossover of the intellect and fighting, participating in matters which affect both and concern both Laches, the general, and Socrates, the philosopher, equally. It is a setting which is significant and worth keeping in mind throughout the dialogue. The notable crossover between matters which concern both the soldier and the philosopher is the education of the young and the nature of virtue. It brings them together for the sake of an honest inquiry, and so hopefully an honest aspiration to live by this thing we call courage. So let's get into Latch's section of dialogue first. Socrates begins by selecting one aspect of virtue, courage. He asks Laches, "What is courage?" Laches answers by stating that courage is standing by your post and not fleeing. Socrates gives examples of military using what we can assume are mobile tactics of fighting, horseback, moving back and forth, and so on. He expands the courageous principle. Quote, this is Socrates here. "For I meant to ask you not only about the courage of heavy armed soldiers, but about the courage of cavalry and every other style of soldier, and not only who are courageous in war, but who are courageous in perils by sea, and who in disease or in poverty or again in politics are courageous, and not only who are courageous against pain and fear, but mighty to contend against pleasures and desires, either fixed in their rank or turning upon their enemy." End quote. So Socrates is basically expanding the principle not just from the battlefield, but into other areas as well. From this, Laches infers that courage is an endurance of the soul. Socrates then asks about the kinds of endurances that endure something foolishly. He gives the example of financial frugality, which is aimed at making more money in the end. Is this courage? And Laches intuitively says no. Socrates then gives examples of two different armies. So basically what we're trying to say here is that, like, you can't expand this indefinitely. You can't say, I went to the supermarket and I was like really smart about I was really smart about how I selected my, groceries. I didn't spend more than I need to. Oh, that's courageous. You can't just expand it into anything. There's a certain there is, like, it's not limited to the battlefield, but there's a certain, but it's also not unlimited to everything. There is an exclusivity here, and I think that part of this is trying to narrow down what that exclusivity is. Um, he gives the sorry. Socrates then gives examples of two different armies: one with the knowledge that they hold superior numbers and position to the enemy, and the other with no knowledge of numbers and position. Which is more courageous? Laches says the latter. Um, Socrates replies by asking if this is not a foolish form of endurance. What Socrates seems to be doing at this point is drawing out a tension between skill and courage. Technical skill and factual knowledge seems to be less courageous than a form of ignorance about one's situation. One can think of a game of Russian roulette. Imagine there are no bullets in the chamber, yet one man thinks there are bullets in the chamber, and the other, whom has knowledge, knows that they're not. And they both agreed to play. Which one is more courageous? We would have to argue the second, as he believes he's truly risking his life and acting nonetheless. Although maybe he's just being an idiot, but nonetheless he is showing some sort of like ability to overcome fear and be self-sacrificial and so on. In other words, awareness of risk seems to be a condition for courage, or else one is just acting foolishly. It could make sense if Laches asserts a lack of knowledge is the more courageous position, even if it comes with the risk of being foolish. Many acts of courage do involve large degrees of ignorance. You think about committing yourself to a relationship. One may feel, perhaps due to bad experiences or just being cynical, the person may cheat on them or suddenly leave them, and they try to figure out what kind of person they are. They may, scour through their social media or go around asking questions about them. And this would hardly strike us as being very romantic. It would seem ignorance is simply, to some extent, part of what is good or noble, like knowledge of mere facts and outcomes and statistical, possibilities and so on, isn't necessarily just having more and more factual knowledge. It doesn't seem to be very cohesive with virtue. I suppose is the kind of point that Laches is trying to draw out. Or Christianity, what Christianity called faith, I think is probably the most extreme example of this. For classically rational Greeks, however, there's a fine line between a lack of knowledge and necessity for virtue and simply a stupid and false belief. And we can assume that there is a line nonetheless. So there is something called kind of foolish, willing to endure something foolishly. That is also a possibility. That is also a real thing. So we have to be careful we have to exclude that from being courageous also. If ignorance makes something more frightening and enduring something more frightening is more courageous, then we can logically infer that ignorance is a necessary part of courage. Can we not? However, if we begin to confuse pure stupidity with courage, that could lead us to a whole different scenario, which I think Socrates is getting at. Is the man who believes he can fly and dies jumping off a cliff courageous? We would implicitly understand that not to be courageous, yet it lacks any concise reason why. And we may admit that the guy who jumps off a cliff and thinks he can fly or die may have some sort of like, I don't know what to call it. Like he may show kind of real conviction even to a complete delusion, which is somewhat self-sacrificial and somewhat, in a weird way, courageous. But at the same time, we wouldn't call it properly courageous because we're also thinking about teaching virtue. So we're not going to teach young people to jump off cliffs thinking they can fly. We're not going to go, oh well, that was a stupid thing to do, but it took balls. We generally wouldn't want to do that. So we also have to think about the fact that they're trying to frame this in the context of kind of an intergenerational movement of knowledge from one generation to the other, and how virtuous virtuous action and character can be properly transmitted. So this is Nicias, and Nicias argues that courage is the knowledge of the grounds of hope and fear. He argues that animals couldn't be courageous because they have no knowledge of things terrible. So in a reversal to Laches, who argued ignorance to the potential outcome of an action is necessary for courage. Nicias believes knowledge of a harmful outcome is a prerequisite for courage. So, for example, a human can grasp the horrors of a bad outcome in much more clarity and detail than an animal, and therefore the human who acts with this dreadful knowledge is more courageous than the ignorant animal. There is merit to this argument. It seems knowledge can potentially degrade or heighten a courageous act. So I don't know. Think of an example. You know, an animal like here's an example. Let's say like you live in like a neighborhood, and there's like it's like a gang or like a mafia, and this person, like if you hurt or annoy this person, it's like the worst person to annoy. They have like a million different ways of making your life miserable. If your dog bit that person because they came into your garden and your dog was being protective, not knowing who that person was, that's probably less courageous than like somebody just being like, I know who this person is. This is like, some gang leader who's crazy and has a million different people that can hurt me, and I'm still gonna stand up to him because he's just an asshole. So like the human with the knowledge of the terrible consequences of what you're doing, we would probably say is more courageous. However, further investigation shows us that Nicias' argument is directed only at knowledge which is future-orientated and predictive of the outcomes of danger, for example. Socrates then tries to redefine this knowledge as not simply being limited to future, but to past, present, and future, all-encompassing. Let's go over this in more detail. Nicias' assertion that courage is a wisdom that has to do with the hopeful and the fearful is dismissed by Socrates, as hope and fear are generally things which are directed at future possibility. Why is this a problem for courage? Why should courage be concerned with all three temporal categories, past, present, future? Perhaps because if courage is abstracted to just to future possibility, removed from present and past, from a continuum, it runs the risk of falling into mere calculation. We can calculate risk by using past data and predicting what may happen in the future, but this primarily rational approach may risk the problem of running into an ad infinitum calculation. Imagine one calculates whether it is more likely to be in their advantage to stand one's ground and fight against an invading army. It may calculatively be more rational to retreat. Yet, if you were to calculate the ends, like they have more soldiers than us, we're doomed, we should just retreat. Yet, this same situation could play out again somewhere else, and again somewhere else, and again somewhere else. So you never stand your ground. You're always reverting. You're never moving towards anything. You're always averting. Rational calculation here is actually a disadvantage to courage and not exactly an advantage, as at no point does the calculated process commit to a position, but is always relative to both external conditions and to the willingness to fight. If one is very reluctant to take any risk, it won't take a lot to put them off. Therefore, in a sense, our rationality can sometimes be contingent of our character and our willingness to endure and so on. Therefore, it is a decision which is constantly relative to the disposition of any particular man or set of men itself. There are a million different pieces of data and facts that could rationally justify a retreat. These facts then become a justification for cowardice rather than part of a wise decision concerning endurance. Courage cannot be relative to the willingness of men to be courageous. We could say it has its own standard which doesn't care too much about your knowledge of statistical advantage or disadvantage. Limitations of both arguments. We seem to be stuck in a tension between knowledge and character. A certain kind of reliance on knowledge could be seen as cowardly, yet total ignorance just appears stupid. And we seem to at least intuitively understand the distinction between an act of courage and a merely reckless act, even if they are somewhat interplaying with each other, in the sense of there's often some stupidity or irrationality in a courageous act, especially if it's harmful or self-sacrificial. Yet it would also be too hasty to claim knowledge and courage don't interplay at all. The fact that we can vaguely distinguish a stupid from courageous acts seems to suggest knowledge about courage is at least possible. And perhaps here is where the distinction could be drawn between a knowledge of conditions and facts that make courage a good idea or rational, and between a knowledge of courage itself. To summarize, the contention between Laches and Nicias, we generally see Laches stand for a deep separation between knowledge and courage. He might imply courage is necessarily ignorance, or at least he intuitively grasps this tension between skill and character, and how mere quantity of facts is not the same thing as such a virtue as courage. While Nicias uses knowledge in a manner which turns into what appears as if mere calculation, and so it is not a knowledge of courage, but simply the knowledge of conditions advantageous to courage, or advantageous to courageous acts. This knowledge is, in a sense, not only of courage, but of conditions. It also, through positing mere calculation, threatens the very virtue of courage. It's actually a threat to it. It's not just a failure to get at it. It's somehow a threat to it. And you could probably say the same thing about like reckless stupidity. It's like if people do something that's so stupid the whole time, the idea of any potential courageous acts may cynically be thrown out the window, because we just think to ourselves, well, hold on, Fukuyama has a really good quote where he says something like, and I bring this up in the Fukuyama section, but he says like, the last man today kind of sits at home congratulating himself for not being stupid enough, not being so stupid to get involved in violent conflicts over whether or not you're German or French or Protestant or Catholic or Christian or Muslim and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of like cynical view which overwhelming stupidity brings out in people, which is like, it kind of degrades something which is self-sacrificial or potentially courageous to something which is just stupid, and then that creates a kind of threat to the virtue of courage, because it's like everything just seems stupid. It loses its meaning and purpose. And that can lead to last men, in the sense that you then condemn everything as irrational. You end up condemning anything potentially courageous itself as merely irrational, and so on. So educating virtue and the nature of endurance. There is also a pedagogical problem with Nicias' rational approach. The problem of abstracting and separating future from the past and present is that we end up calculating what is good, secure, and prosperous from the future without ourselves living through that which may, as a virtue, be brought out, I should have said, in humans. In education, we're interested in the continuum of knowledge, hence the reason the disillusioned characters at the beginning of their dialogue were angry at their fathers. Their fathers and grandfathers accomplished great things and left the next generations to simply have knowledge of that greatness without actually experiencing it themselves. Endurance, for example, I'll just keep reading. I think I get to this point. Endurance, for example, is something one can't learn from a simple route learning or reading a book. One doesn't know what a cold water plunge feels like until they get into the water. They don't know what it's like to finish a marathon without running it. Certainly don't know how courageous they are without experiencing danger and just reading about it or thinking about it. We could say this: Laches intuitively grasps how endurance is part of courage, but foolish endurance becomes a risk. So Nicias wants to merely calculate the exercises. Should we endure danger for a victory in a battlefield so that we can be free? Should we endure the risk of emotional turmoil by getting involved in a romantic relationship? Yet these things seem simply wrong to just calculate. A problem with means and ends also arises here. If we could simply calculate the value of enduring and overcoming by predicting the end, we no longer need virtuous people. We simply need what in modern times we've created through data collection and algorithms and other forms of intelligence. Something like risk assessment or choice architecture is another interesting term for this, which can only see a predicted end and cannot grasp the nature of the means. In simpler terms, a goal for the virtuous man is not simply the rational ability to get to an end, it is also the ability to grasp the virtuous means by which to get there. Or perhaps even to just endure for the sake of an end which is not yet clear but somehow understood through the threat of its loss. The threat of the loss of not being able to endure. What is lost because you're not able to endure. Perhaps intuitively, thus highlighting the continuum of knowledge rather than the static point of factual truth. And the static point of factual truth is like the end of history, we could say, is here in this static point. And the people at the end of history, they have this knowledge of like, peaceful, rational, democratic society, and they have all this knowledge of what happened in history, and they have all the scientific knowledge of what the world is made up of, and so on, at least in a kind of scientific sense. But they have no knowledge of the means of getting to the position we're in today, the kind of struggle and so on, which occurred to get to this position. In other words, we may not understand ourselves as virtuous until something threatens that virtue, or until we fail at being virtuous. And then the need to endure the pains and fears that stand in the way of being virtuous must be endured, even if no clear goal exists. The feeling of shame is important in the beginning of this dialogue, as it is vague. The characters want to understand what it is they feel shame about. They don't simply know. If they simply knew, they would just fix that problem, right? If you're like, well, I feel shame because of this reason, well, so then just do whatever it is that will overcome that. But they don't know. That's the point. Because they have no knowledge of the means. So they don't know what it is that they're not achieving. Because an end can be a simple objective goal, but means cannot be reduced necessarily to a simple objective goal. So you can't just go, this is the thing they feel shame about. They don't really know. So in education, we are interested in the continuum of knowledge, which is why the nature of courage and not just the particular actions which are courageous are investigated, and hence the reason the disillusioned characters were angry at their fathers. Their fathers and grandfathers accomplished great things and left the next generations to simply enjoy the benefits without needing to endure the trials that got them there. In this sense, they may have knowledge of courageous things, but they have no knowledge of courage itself, which I think is probably the point of the dialogue. And so despite all their material and social rewards, they feel a sort of ignorance or even impoverishment, which is ironic because they're very, very wealthy. So that's it. I'll leave the link in the description for the actual ebook if you want to get the whole thing, and subscribe if you haven't subscribed before. Thank you.